In the spring of 1939, long before Japan's cities burned and its skies filled with bombers, a narrow laboratory corridor in Tokyo echoed with a sound few people noticed. It was not an explosion, not an engine, not even a human voice. It was a pulse. Short, clean, almost delicate. A metal instrument on a wooden bench emitted it repeatedly, sending invisible waves into the air, waiting for something to come back. At that moment, almost no one in the Imperial Japanese Army understood what they were hearing. The man who did understand stood alone at the far end of the room. His name was Hidetsugu Yagi. He was not a general. He wore no uniform. He did not belong to any combat unit. But what he was working on that day would later become one of the most important principles of modern warfare. And in 1939, it was already working. Yagi had been a physicist for most of his adult life. Born in Osaka in the final decade of the 19th century, he grew up during a period when Japan was rapidly absorbing Western science while still deeply suspicious of it. His education followed that tension. German textbooks, British journals, Japanese discipline. By the early 1920s, Yagi was already known in academic circles for his work on electromagnetic waves. He was meticulous, quiet, obsessed with precision. In 1926, together with his colleague Shintaro Uda, he had published a paper describing a directional antenna capable of transmitting and receiving radio waves with remarkable efficiency. Outside Japan, it would later be known simply as the Yagi-Uda antenna. Inside Japan, it was barely noticed. The irony would take decades to fully reveal itself. By the late 1930s, radio technology had become a battlefield of its own. Nations competed not only in tanks and aircraft, but in frequencies, signals, and invisibility. Britain experimented with early warning systems along its coast. Germany refined radio navigation for bombers. The United States invested heavily in detection technologies, though much of it remained classified. Japan, however, stood at a crossroads. Its military doctrine emphasized speed, surprise, and the decisive blow. There was little patience for systems that did not promise immediate, visible results. And Yagi's work promised something abstract: detection without sight, distance without contact. A way to know where an enemy was before the enemy knew you existed. In theory, it was revolutionary. In practice, it was inconvenient. In the Tokyo laboratory, Yagi's prototype occupied little space: coils, tubes, a rotating antenna array. Nothing about it looked like a weapon. Nothing about it suggested power. Yet when activated, the system sent radio pulses outward and measured the faint echoes that returned after striking distant objects. Metal reflected more strongly than land. Movement altered timing. Altitude changed signal strength. With enough refinement, Yagi believed, one could locate aircraft beyond visual range. Years before radar became a household word. The problem was not physics. The problem was belief. When Yagi presented his findings to military representatives, the reactions were cautious at best. Most officers lacked the technical background to understand what they were seeing. Others dismissed it as academic curiosity. A colonel reportedly asked a single question after one demonstration. "Can it stop a bomber?" Yagi answered honestly. "Not directly." That was enough. Funding was limited. Support was inconsistent. The project was neither cancelled nor embraced. It existed in a bureaucratic gray zone, surviving on university resources and the stubborn persistence of its creator. Meanwhile, across the world, similar ideas were taking root elsewhere. In Britain, chain home stations rose quietly along the coast. In Germany, engineers refined radio-based navigation beams. In the United States, secret laboratories accelerated research under naval contracts. Yagi knew this. He read foreign journals. He followed patents. He understood that Japan was not alone in this race. What troubled him was not competition. It was indifference. By 1940, the world had changed dramatically. War engulfed Europe. Aircraft ranges increased. Bombing accuracy improved. Detection became not a luxury, but a necessity. Still, in Japan, the emphasis remained offensive. Carrier aviation, long-range strikes, surprise attacks. Early warning was considered defensive. Defensive thinking was considered weakness. Yagi's laboratory continued its work, but now under increasing pressure. Materials became harder to obtain. Military oversight increased, but without clear direction. The expectation was results, but the definition of results remained vague. In private correspondence, Yagi expressed concern. He wrote of missed opportunities, of ideas dismissed too early, of technologies whose value would only become clear after catastrophe. He was not wrong. In December 1941, Japan launched its attack on Pearl Harbor. The operation succeeded tactically, but it also revealed a critical vulnerability. Japan had struck blindly. The attack relied on secrecy, timing, and luck. There was no system capable of providing early warning of counterattack, no network to detect incoming aircraft over long distances, no reliable method to track enemy movement beyond the horizon. The very problem Yagi had been working to solve. As the war expanded across the Pacific, the consequences became unavoidable. American industrial power translated rapidly into technological superiority. Radar-equipped ships and aircraft altered the balance of naval warfare. Surprise became harder. Ambushes failed. Losses mounted. Only then did attitudes begin to shift. Military authorities returned to projects once ignored. Laboratories were revisited. Old proposals were dusted off, including Yagi's. But by then, time had become an enemy. Efforts were made to adapt his concepts into workable detection systems. Experimental installations appeared along coastlines. Training manuals were written hastily. Equipment was produced in limited numbers. It was not enough. The systems lacked standardization. Power supplies were unreliable. Operator training was inconsistent. Integration with command structures was poor. Most critically, the technology had arrived too late to shape doctrine. Yagi watched this unfold with mixed emotions. Validation came, but it was hollow. His ideas were no longer theoretical, but their implementation was rushed and incomplete. He had been right, and that knowledge carried weight. As air raids intensified over Japan, detection failures had real consequences. Cities burned without warning. Factories were destroyed before defenses could respond. Civilians died not because Japan lacked courage or industry, but because it lacked time. And time had been wasted years earlier. By 1943, Allied air superiority was overwhelming. Radar networks elsewhere had matured into complex systems of coordination and response. Japan struggled to replicate what others had refined through years of uninterrupted development. In the background of this technological race stood Yagi's early work, a reminder that the future had once been within reach. But recognition, when it finally arrived, came from an unexpected direction. After the war, as Japan lay in ruins, Western engineers reviewed captured documents and equipment. Among the papers were references to Yagi's antenna designs and early detection experiments. To their surprise, many principles matched systems they themselves had developed independently. In some cases, years later. The realization was uncomfortable. Japan had possessed the foundation for advanced detection technology before the war had even begun. It simply had not known what to do with it. Yagi himself survived the war. He returned to academic life, his reputation gradually restored in international circles. His antenna design became ubiquitous, mounted on rooftops across the world, receiving television signals instead of tracking enemy aircraft. The weapon he had envisioned never truly existed in the form he imagined. But the principle endured. Detection. Awareness. The power of seeing before being seen. In 1939, it had been an abstract idea in a quiet Tokyo laboratory. In the decades that followed, it became a cornerstone of modern warfare. And for those who understood its value too late, it served as a lesson written in fire. By the time Japan recognized what it had overlooked, the war had already decided the price of delay. By the time Japanese authorities fully turned their attention back to Hidetsugu Yagi's work, the war had already shifted into a different phase. Speed was no longer enough. Courage no longer compensated for blindness. And surprise, once Japan's greatest advantage, had become unreliable. The first serious attempts to operationalize Yagi's ideas began quietly in late 1941 and early 1942. There were no grand announcements, no official doctrine changes, just small groups of engineers reassigned, a few coastal facilities repurposed, and a growing sense of urgency behind closed doors. The problem was not that the science was wrong. The problem was that the system had never been built to scale. Yagi's early prototypes had been laboratory instruments, precise, fragile, dependent on stable power supplies and careful calibration. Translating that into rugged, field-ready equipment required an industrial base already under strain from naval losses and resource shortages. Japan did not lack intelligence. It lacked margin for error. At several locations along the Pacific coast, experimental detection stations were installed. Tall antenna arrays rose from cliffs and hills, their silhouettes visible against the sky. Operators were trained hastily, often learning the theory and practice at the same time. There was no unified command structure, no standardized reporting protocol, no clear understanding of how early warning should influence air defense decisions. In Britain, radar operators fed information into centralized control rooms. Fighter squadrons were scrambled based on plotted tracks. Every link in the chain had been tested under pressure. In Japan, the chain barely existed. Signals were detected, but not trusted. Warnings were issued, but not acted upon. False positives eroded confidence. In one documented case, operators detected unusual echoes offshore hours before an Allied reconnaissance flight appeared. The report moved slowly through the hierarchy. By the time action was authorized, the aircraft had already completed its mission. The system had worked. The response had not. Yagi observed these developments from a distance. His role was advisory, not authoritative. He could explain what the signals meant. He could suggest improvements, but he could not reshape doctrine, and doctrine, once established, resists change even under fire. As 1942 turned into 1943, the technological gap widened. Allied forces refined radar-guided night bombing. Naval engagements increasingly depended on detection rather than visual contact. Submarine warfare shifted decisively in favor of those who could see first. Japan attempted to adapt. New models were developed. Some incorporated improvements inspired directly by Yagi's early designs. Directional antennas were optimized. Signal processing was enhanced. But production numbers remained low. Factories struggled with shortages of copper, vacuum tubes, and skilled labor. Air raids disrupted supply chains. Training programs were shortened to meet demand, sacrificing depth for speed. The irony was painful. The foundational concept had been there from the beginning. What was missing was time. Yagi's frustration grew, though he expressed it rarely and only in careful language. In private notes, he questioned whether his work should have been pursued differently, whether he had failed to communicate its importance, whether a more aggressive approach earlier might have changed outcomes. But history does not reward hypotheticals. By mid-1943, Japan's cities began to feel the full weight of strategic bombing. Detection systems provided limited warning, but coverage was inconsistent. Some regions received alerts, others remained exposed. Civilians heard sirens too late. The weapon Yagi had imagined was not meant to destroy aircraft directly. It was meant to change behavior, to give commanders options, to compress reaction times, to transform chaos into information. Instead, information arrived fragmented and often ignored. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, the Allies drew their own conclusions. Captured Japanese equipment revealed a surprising level of theoretical understanding. Directional antennas similar to Yagi's designs appeared in unexpected places. Western analysts took notice. Reports circulated noting that Japanese researchers had independently developed principles comparable to early radar work elsewhere, and in some cases, earlier. The implication was unsettling. Japan had not been technologically backward. It had been organizationally unprepared. As the war neared its final phase, Yagi's involvement diminished further. Resources were redirected toward desperate measures. Research institutions were repurposed or destroyed, laboratories emptied. The question was no longer how to win. It was how to survive. When the war ended in 1945, Japan faced devastation unlike anything in its history. Cities lay in ruins. Infrastructure collapsed. Millions were displaced. Amid the rubble, scientific priorities shifted overnight. Occupation authorities evaluated Japanese technology with clinical efficiency. What could be repurposed? What posed risks? What held value? Yagi's work surfaced again. This time, it was not dismissed. American engineers recognized the elegance of his antenna design immediately. Simple, efficient, highly directional. Ideal for both transmission and reception, it fit perfectly into post-war communications needs. Ironically, the very technology once deemed impractical for war found new life in peace. Yagi cooperated fully. He shared knowledge. He taught. He rebuilt academic programs from scratch. His international reputation grew steadily during the late 1940s and early 1950s. Outside Japan, his name became attached permanently to a device used around the world. Inside Japan, his story remained complicated. He was neither celebrated nor condemned. He was remembered quietly as a scientist whose ideas had arrived at the wrong moment, or perhaps at the right moment, but in the wrong hands. As radar technology evolved through the Cold War, its origins blurred into a web of parallel discoveries and incremental improvements. Few traced the lineage back to a modest Tokyo laboratory and a physicist sending invisible pulses into the air in 1939. Fewer still considered what might have happened had those pulses been taken seriously from the start. The war had shown that weapons do not always look like weapons. Sometimes they resemble questions, data, warnings, and sometimes ignoring them proves more destructive than any bomb. Yagi lived long enough to see his work become ordinary. Antennas sprouted from rooftops, signals filled the air, detection became mundane. What had once been revolutionary faded into background noise, yet the lesson remained. Innovation does not win wars by itself. Belief, organization, and timing decide whether innovation matters. Japan had possessed the first piece. It lacked the others. And in the end, the cost of that imbalance was paid in silence, long after the pulses had faded. In the decades that followed the war, the world moved quickly, too quickly for memory. Technologies born in secrecy became ordinary tools. Concepts once debated in dim laboratories entered everyday life without ceremony. Radar screens, antennas, detection systems, all of it faded into the background of modern existence. Hidetsugu Yagi watched this transformation quietly. He did not lecture about missed chances. He did not write memoirs accusing institutions or individuals. He returned to teaching, research, and rebuilding what had been destroyed. Japan's post-war scientific community faced a difficult reckoning. Much of its wartime research had been fragmented, poorly documented, or deliberately obscured. Occupation authorities encouraged transparency but imposed limits. Entire programs vanished into archives or were dismantled without analysis. In that environment, Yagi's work stood out for a different reason. It survived. Not because it had been successful in war, but because it was useful in peace. The Yagi-Uda antenna, once dismissed as impractical, proved ideal for civilian broadcasting. Television networks adopted it rapidly. Radio communications relied on its efficiency. Engineers appreciated its simplicity and reliability. Across continents, millions of homes installed a design conceived decades earlier in Japan. Few knew the name behind it. Fewer still knew the original intent. In military circles, radar evolved rapidly during the early Cold War. Detection systems became integrated with command networks. Data flowed instantly. Automation replaced intuition. The idea of fighting blind became unthinkable. Looking back, analysts recognized a pattern repeated across history. Technological superiority does not come from invention alone. It comes from institutional trust. Yagi's story became a case study, though rarely cited publicly. Internal reports referenced early Japanese research that paralleled Western developments, but failed to mature. The conclusion was consistent. Japan had not lacked intelligence or creativity. It had lacked the willingness to reorganize around unfamiliar ideas. That reluctance proved fatal. During the war, Japanese air defense never achieved coherence. Warning times remained short. Coordination between detection, command, and interception was inconsistent. Even when equipment existed, doctrine lagged behind. By contrast, nations that embraced early detection reshaped warfare itself. Battles were decided before contact. Attrition shifted away from surprise toward information dominance. This was the world Yagi had foreseen, not in detail, but in principle. He understood that knowing first changed everything. Late in his career, when asked about his wartime research, Yagi responded cautiously. He avoided judgment. He avoided speculation. He simply stated that science advances regardless of readiness. Whether society keeps up is another matter. That restraint defined his legacy. Unlike many wartime figures, Yagi was neither lionized nor vilified. He represented something more uncomfortable, a missed opportunity. His work forced observers to confront an unsettling truth. History is not shaped only by decisive actions. It is shaped equally by ignored warnings. The most dangerous weapon is not always the one deployed too early. Sometimes, it is the one dismissed too soon. In retrospect, Japan's failure was not technical. It was cultural. Hierarchies resisted disruption. Decision-makers favored proven methods over theoretical advantages. Short-term clarity outweighed long-term transformation. Radar demanded faith in abstraction, in invisible forces, in data without immediate confirmation. For a military steeped in visual dominance and direct engagement, this shift was profound. Yagi had offered a bridge between worlds. No one crossed it in time. By the time Japan attempted to integrate detection systems seriously, the strategic environment had closed. Allied industrial output dwarfed Japanese capacity. Air superiority rendered incremental improvements irrelevant. The war's outcome was sealed. What remained was legacy. In post-war Japan, scientific education underwent reform. Greater emphasis was placed on interdisciplinary collaboration. Civilian research gained autonomy. Military influence receded. Quietly, the lessons of the past filtered into policy, not as apology, as caution. Today, Yagi's antenna stands as a paradox. It is among the most widely used designs in communications history. Elegant, enduring, invisible in its ubiquity. Yet its original promise was never fulfilled when it mattered most. That tension defines the story. Innovation is not heroic by default. It does not demand recognition. It simply waits. Sometimes, it waits too long. In the end, Hidetsugu Yagi did not create a weapon in the traditional sense. He created a way of seeing, a way to extend perception beyond human limits. Others would turn that insight into dominance, into deterrence, into doctrine. Japan, for a brief moment, held the key, then set it aside. The tragedy was not that the future arrived late. It arrived early and was ignored. For modern audiences, the lesson remains uncomfortably relevant. Breakthroughs often appear unimpressive at first. They challenge habits. They demand structural change. They threaten established authority. The question is never whether they work. The question is whether anyone is willing to believe them. Yagi believed. History did not until it was too late.